I am Victor Caldwell, 70 years old and somehow still breathing after the people I loved most tried to carve me open. As a man who spent 40 years building a logistics empire on the unforgiving docks of Boston, I thought I knew how to spot a predator. I thought my wealth would protect my family. Instead, it turned them into monsters. I was supposed to be dying. I was lying on an operating table waiting for a surgeon to cut a massive tumor out of my liver. But then the surgeon pulled back my hospital gown, saw a 35-year-old burn scar on my hip, and dropped his metal scalpel right onto the floor. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth always finds a way to come to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. The cold steel of the operating table bit through the thin fabric of my hospital gown, sending a shiver deep into my aging bones. Above me, the blinding clinical lights of the surgical suite flared to life, forcing me to squint against the harsh white glare. The air in the room was exceptionally sterile, smelling faintly of iodine and harsh rubbing alcohol, a scent that made my stomach churn with an overwhelming sense of dread. A steady rhythmic beeping from the heart monitor echoed off the pale walls, counting out the seconds of what I truly believed were the final moments of my life. I could feel the heavy numbing weight of the anesthesia creeping up my arms, turning my blood to lead, and making my limbs feel like they belonged to someone else. My vision was already beginning to blur at the edges, the masked faces of the surgical nurses swimming in and out of focus like ghosts in a fog. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, trying to steady my erratic breathing. I was 70 years old. For 4 relentless decades, I had hauled freight-managed cutthroat contracts and fought tooth and nail to build a logistics business from a single rusty truck into a massive fleet that dominated the Boston shipyards. I had survived labor strikes, vicious competitors, and the bitter freezing winter nights working on the docks. My body was a map of old aches and worn joints, a physical testament to a lifetime of grueling, unrelenting physical labor. Yet after all those battles, all those years of sacrificing my own health, so my wife Evelyn and my son Preston could live in absolute luxury, I was supposedly being brought down by a sudden, incredibly aggressive tumor. A silent killer hiding deep inside my own liver. Or so I thought. The lead surgeon, Dr. Harrison Blake, stepped up to the right side of the table. Even through the heavy fog of the chemical sedatives pumping into my veins, I could hear the sharp, sterile snap of his latex gloves snapping into place over his wrists. I heard the metallic clatter of surgical instruments being meticulously laid out on the stainless steel tray right beside my head. The sound of a heavy scalpel being picked up sent a final desperate jolt of adrenaline coursing through my fading consciousness. Dr. Blake reached out and gently pulled back the lower half of my hospital gown to apply the surgical antiseptic to my right side, exposing my hip and abdomen to the freezing air of the room. And then time simply stopped. The rhythmic mechanical sounds of the operating room were suddenly shattered by a sharp ringing clang. The heavy metal scalpel slipped from Dr. Blake's gloved fingers and crashed onto the stainless steel tray, bouncing off the edge and clattering loudly onto the sterile tile floor. The room fell completely suffocatingly silent. The nurses froze in their tracks. The anesthesiologist looked up from his monitors in absolute shock. I forced my heavy eyelids open, fighting through the thick chemical haze that was rapidly clouding my brain. I looked up at Dr. Blake. His face, visible just above his light blue surgical mask, had drained of all its color. He looked as though all the blood had suddenly rushed out of his body. His eyes were wide, dilated with absolute raw disbelief, staring fixedly at the lower right side of my hip. He was not looking at the surgical site where he was supposed to make his first incision. He was looking at the jagged, twisted, tree root-shaped burn scar that covered the side of my waist. It was a highly unique, terrible mark I had carried for 35 years, a permanent physical reminder of a horrific car fire I had dragged a young stranger out of decades ago. Dr. Blake took a stumbling step backward, his hands visibly shaking in the bright light. The nurses exchanged confused, panicked glances. One of them stepped forward, her voice muffled by her mask, asking him if he was all right, asking if he needed to step out of the room for a moment. He did not answer her. He did not even blink. He just kept staring at that twisted, ugly scar on my hip, as if it held the secrets of the universe. Then he leaned down. He leaned so incredibly close to my face that I could feel the ragged, uneven warmth of his breath against my cheek. He positioned himself perfectly so that none of the surrounding surgical staff could hear what he was about to say. His voice was nothing more than a trembling, desperate whisper. "It is you, my God, it is really you." My heart gave a violent lurch against my ribs. The monitor beside me spiked instantly, the slow, steady beeps suddenly turning rapid and frantic, echoing my internal panic. I tried to speak, to open my mouth and ask him what he meant, but my tongue felt thick and entirely useless. The anesthesia was pulling me down rapidly, acting like a heavy iron chain, dragging me toward the dark bottom of the ocean. Dr. Blake gripped my shoulder, his fingers digging into my bare skin with terrifying strength. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a sudden burning urgency that pierced right through the fog in my mind. "Victor," he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion I could not comprehend. "Victor, listen to me. Do not close your eyes. Fight the drugs. You have to hear me." I could barely keep my eyelids open, the bright surgical lights blurring into long, painful streaks of white across my vision. Pure panic began to claw at the edges of my fading mind. Why did he know my name like that? Why was he looking at me with such absolute, unfiltered horror? "They are lying to you." Dr. Blake breathed directly into my ear, his words hitting me like a physical, crushing blow to the chest. "All of them. Your family. The other doctors at this clinic. They are lying. You do not have a tumor, Victor. There is absolutely nothing wrong with your liver." The words echoed violently in my fading mind, crashing against everything I thought I knew to be true. No tumor. But the scans. The agonizing pain I had been feeling. Evelyn weeping inconsolably in the doctor's office. Preston promising to sell his startup shares to save my life. My own son holding my hand just an hour ago and telling me everything would be all right. I tried to gasp for air, tried to lift my arm and rip the intravenous line out of my vein, but my body utterly refused to obey my commands. The paralytic effect of the drugs had taken full control over my muscles. I was trapped inside my own failing body, unable to scream, unable to move a single inch, fully and terrifyingly aware that I was lying on an operating table surrounded by sharp instruments, having just been told my entire reality was a carefully fabricated nightmare. "I'm not going to cut you," Dr. Blake whispered frantically, his grip on my shoulder tightening even further as he noticed my eyes beginning to flutter and roll back. "I know what they are trying to do. I know what they hired me for today, but I remember what you did for me all those years ago. I remember this scar. I am going to stop this, Victor. But you have to trust me. You have to play dead. Play dead." The horrific words swirled in my head, mixing with the dark, heavy tide of the anesthesia. My mind desperately clawed for answers in the dark. If I did not have a tumor, why was I here? Why had my wife of 40 years packed my personal belongings into black trash bags just days ago? Why had my son rushed me to this hidden private clinic instead of our regular trusted family hospital? Through the deafening roar of my own heartbeat, a fragmented memory suddenly pierced through the mental fog. A hushed midnight conversation on the backyard patio. My son Preston whispering furiously into his phone about a $5 million crypto transfer, about a rare O-negative cargo being ready for harvest next week. My blood type. O-negative. The paralyzing, world-shattering realization hit me just as the final wave of chemical darkness pulled me completely under. They were not trying to save my life. They were trying to harvest my organs to pay off my son's debts. I could feel a solitary tear slip from the corner of my eye, sliding down my cheek as the harsh surgical lights finally faded to black. The sheer calculated cruelty of my own flesh and blood shattered my soul into a million jagged pieces. As I slipped into the cold void of unconsciousness, My mind violently snapped back to the beginning, rewinding to exactly 3 weeks ago, to the day my family first decided that I was worth more to them dead than alive. 3 weeks ago, the morning began just like any other in our Boston home. The coastal wind was rattling the heavy oak window frames, and I was sitting at the kitchen island, going over the weekly freight reports from my old logistics firm. Even though I had retired, turning the daily operations over to a management team, old habits die hard. My daughter-in-law Monica had stopped by early, as she often did lately. She was wearing her expensive yoga gear, smelling of lavender and privilege. For the past month, she had taken a sudden, intense interest in my health. She insisted that a man of my age needed far better nutrition, specifically a custom-blended protein shake she had supposedly researched extensively. I never liked the taste of it. It was chalky thick and left a strange, bitter, almost metallic residue on the back of my tongue. But Monica would stand there with that bright, practiced smile, watching me drink every last drop. She called it her special recipe for my longevity. That morning I drank the gray sludge, forced a smile, and thanked her. She rinsed the glass with unusual thoroughness, kissed my cheek, and hurried out the door to meet Preston. Less than 20 minutes later, the first cramp hit me. It was not a normal stomach ache. It felt as though a serrated blade was violently twisting inside my gut. I dropped my pen. It clattered against the granite countertop, rolling onto the floor. I tried to stand up from the stool, intending to walk to the sink for a glass of water, but my legs completely gave out beneath me. My knees buckled as if my bones had turned to liquid. I crashed onto the hardwood floor, knocking a heavy ceramic bowl off the counter. The bowl shattered into dozens of pieces around me. The pain radiating from my abdomen was absolute agony. I had broken bones on the shipping docks, crushed my hand under heavy machinery in my 20s, but nothing compared to this. It was a vicious, searing heat that spread through my chest and down my limbs. My breathing became ragged and shallow. I pressed my hands against my stomach, curling into a tight ball, gasping desperately for air that suddenly felt too thick to breathe. A profound, terrifying lethargy washed over my entire body. I could not move my arms. I could not push myself up from the floor. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, blinding me as it dripped into my eyes. The grand, spacious kitchen of the mansion I had worked 40 years to build suddenly felt like a shrinking, airless tomb. My vision began to swim, the expensive, recessed lighting above me blurring into harsh, painful streaks of white. I tried to call out for help, but the sound was trapped in my throat, emerging only as a weak, pathetic wheeze. Evelyn came rushing down the grand staircase at the sound of the crash. I remember the exact look on her face as she rounded the corner and saw me writhing on the floor among the broken ceramic shards. For a split second, a fraction of a heartbeat, her expression was entirely blank, cold, analytical, and devoid of any human emotion. But the moment our eyes met, she snapped into a frantic, hysterical performance. She screamed my name, dropping the laundry basket she was holding. She threw herself onto the floor beside me, gripping my shoulders and shaking me as if trying to wake me from a deep sleep. Her voice was shrill, echoing loudly off the high ceilings as she wailed about how cold my skin felt, about how pale I was. I tried to tell her to call for an ambulance, my voice barely a strained whisper escaping my lips. My vision was tunneling, darkening at the edges, but I could clearly hear her fumbling with her phone. She was crying loudly, a chaotic display of marital devotion, but I noticed her hands were remarkably steady as she dialed. She did not dial emergency services. She dialed our son. She spoke rapidly into the receiver, her voice pitched high with manufactured terror, demanding that he get to the house immediately. She did not mention my symptoms to a medical professional. She only told Preston that it was happening right now. At the time, through the haze of my agony, I thought she was simply too panicked to think straight. I believed she was acting out of pure shock and fear of losing her husband of 4 decades. Preston arrived less than 15 minutes later. He burst through the front door, his expensive suit jacket flapping open, playing the role of the terrified, deeply devoted son to absolute perfection. He slid across the kitchen floor, skidding to a halt right beside his mother. He grabbed my hand, his grip uncomfortably tight. The son whose elite Ivy League tuition was paid for by my decades of inhaling diesel fumes and lifting heavy cargo pallets was now staring down at me with wide, panicked eyes. I was still struggling to breathe, the searing pain in my stomach, refusing to subside, my entire body trembling uncontrollably. I squeezed his hand back, grateful, feeling a foolish, overwhelming wave of paternal love. I believed in my highly vulnerable state that my family was rallying around me in a moment of dire crisis. I managed to force out a single word, begging them to call an ambulance to take me to the local public hospital. But Evelyn immediately cut me off, shaking her head vigorously, her perfectly manicured hands wiping away imaginary tears from her cheeks. She insisted that public emergency rooms were far too slow, too crowded, and too chaotic to handle a medical crisis of this magnitude for a man of my wealth and status. She argued that putting me in the back of a standard ambulance would only expose me to infections and hours of agonizing delays in a dirty, overpacked waiting area where no one would prioritize my care. Preston forcefully agreed with her, his voice projecting a firm, protective authority that left absolutely no room for debate. He declared that he knew exactly where to take me. He claimed he had a close friend, a brilliant medical specialist, at a highly discreet, state-of-the-art private clinic just outside the city limits. This doctor, he promised, could bypass all the bureaucratic waiting times, pull all the necessary strings, and see me immediately in a private suite. They pulled me up from the floor, their hands surprisingly rough and impatient, as they dragged my dead, uncooperative weight toward the garage door. I was in far too much agony to argue, my mind deeply clouded by the unnatural, heavy lethargy aggressively gripping my entire nervous system. I could not stand on my own. I could barely keep my head up. I simply surrendered to them, trusting my beloved wife and my only son with my life. I let them put me into the back seat of Preston's luxury sedan, completely unaware that they were not saving my life, but delivering me straight into a deadly trap. The heavy leather seats of Preston's sedan offered no comfort as my vision slowly began to return. My breathing was still shallow, and every bump in the road sent a fresh wave of agony through my abdomen. I expected to hear the chaotic sirens of an ambulance or the familiar noise of downtown Boston traffic. I expected we were heading toward Massachusetts General Hospital, where my primary care physician had kept my medical records for the past 15 years. Instead, the scenery outside the tinted windows was unfamiliar and alarmingly quiet. We were driving through a secluded, heavily wooded suburb far away from the bustling city center. Large iron gates parted silently as Preston steered the vehicle onto a perfectly paved driveway lined with immaculate landscaping. This was not a hospital. The building looked more like an ultra-exclusive corporate retreat or a luxury wellness spa. There were no emergency room signs and no frantic paramedics rushing patients through sliding glass doors. The discreet brass plaque near the entrance simply read, "The Shaw Institute." I weakly asked Preston why we were here instead of the public hospital. My son kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, his grip tight on the leather steering wheel. He explained in a smooth, confident tone that public hospitals were fundamentally broken, plagued by long wait times and overworked staff. He promised me that he had already made several calls on the drive over and secured the absolute best medical attention money could buy. He told me that this private facility was highly specialized catering only to elite clients who needed immediate, discreet care without the bureaucratic delays of standard medicine. I was too weak to argue with his logic. My entire body felt as though it had been drained of its natural strength, leaving me completely dependent on his guidance. Evelyn sat in the back seat beside me, gently stroking my clammy forehead with a silk handkerchief. She murmured soft words of comfort, assuring me that our son knew exactly what he was doing and that I was in the safest possible hands. Two men in pristine white uniforms approached the vehicle the moment we parked in the shaded portico. They did not look like standard hospital orderlies. They moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, helping me out of the passenger seat and placing me into a plush wheelchair. As they wheeled me through the heavy glass doors, the interior of the clinic struck me as completely surreal. The lobby was adorned with polished marble floors, abstract modern art, and soft ambient lighting that felt deliberately designed to soothe wealthy patrons. There was no smell of iodine or bleach here, only a faint, expensive floral scent. We were escorted immediately past the empty reception desk and guided down a long, silent corridor into an expansive consultation room. The room featured dark mahogany paneling and a large, sleek desk facing a wall of illuminated medical viewing screens. A moment later, the door clicked open and a man walked in. He introduced himself as Dr. Gregory Shaw. He did not wear a traditional white coat, opting instead for a sharply tailored charcoal suit with a subtle silk tie. His smile was polished, his handshake firm, yet his eyes held a cold, calculating emptiness that sent a strange, instinctual shiver down my spine. Dr. Shaw did not waste time with pleasantries or preliminary medical history questions. He spoke with an intense, practiced urgency that completely dominated the room. He claimed that Preston had briefed him on my sudden symptoms and that his specialized medical team had already run rapid diagnostic tests on the blood samples they drew the moment I crossed the threshold. Dr. Shaw walked over to the illuminated viewing board and smoothly clipped a large imaging scan onto the glowing white surface. He pointed a sleek silver pen at a dark, blurry shadow located on the right side of the printed image. My eyes struggled to focus on the dark mass he was highlighting. He turned to face my wife and son with an expression of grave professional sorrow. He announced in a steady and unyielding voice that the sudden onset of my extreme abdominal pain and severe lethargy was not a random anomaly. He declared that I was suffering from an incredibly aggressive, massive tumor that had silently and rapidly developed on the right lobe of my liver. According to his instantaneous analysis, the mass was expanding at a catastrophic rate. He looked directly into my eyes and delivered a death sentence with terrifying calmness. He stated that without immediate, highly complex surgical intervention to remove the affected lobe, the tumor would undoubtedly metastasize and spread through my entire system. He gave me an absolute maximum of 1 month to live. The sheer finality of his words hung in the quiet room like a physical weight crushing the remaining air from my lungs. 1 short, single month, I had survived decades of grueling labor, built a sprawling company from nothing. And now a stranger in an expensive suit was telling me my life would be completely over in 30 days. I stared at the blurry image on the light board, my mind reeling, trying to process the horrifying reality that a massive tumor had somehow grown inside me without presenting a single warning sign until this very morning. The reaction from my family was immediate and utterly devastating. Evelyn let out a choked, guttural gasp and physically collapsed into my arms. She buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing with such intense, raw desperation that her entire body shook against mine. She cried out that she could not lose me, that we were supposed to spend our golden retirement years traveling together, that she simply could not imagine waking up in our home without me. Her tears soaked through my shirt, warming my cold skin. Preston fell to his knees right beside my wheelchair. He reached out and gripped my shoulder with fierce, unyielding determination. His face was a mask of pure, concentrated resolve, his jaw tightly clenched as he looked up at me. He swore to me that he would never let this disease take me away from them. He looked at Dr. Shaw and demanded that they schedule the emergency surgery immediately, regardless of the exorbitant cost. He turned back to me, his voice thick with apparent emotion, and promised that he would liquidate his own valuable startup shares by the end of the week, just to pay for the absolute best surgical suite this private clinic had to offer. He stated that he would sacrifice his entire business venture to secure the top medical team to save my life. Sitting there in that quiet, luxurious room, surrounded by my weeping wife and my fiercely protective son, a foolish, overwhelming wave of paternal love completely washed over my terrified heart. I looked at the 2 people I had spent my entire life providing for, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude. I genuinely believed that my family was uniting in my darkest hour, ready to sacrifice absolutely everything they had to pull me back from the brink of death. The ride back to our Boston mansion was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. I sat in the passenger seat of Preston's luxury sedan, staring blankly out the window at the passing trees. The excruciating pain in my abdomen had dulled to a persistent throbbing ache, but the profound lethargy still clung to my bones. Preston kept his eyes rigidly focused on the road, his knuckles stark white as he gripped the steering wheel, driving with an unnatural haste. Evelyn sat in the back, dabbing at her eyes with her silk handkerchief, occasionally reaching forward to squeeze my shoulder in a silent show of support. I should have felt comforted. I had just been handed a terrifying death sentence, and my family was right there beside me, promising to fight the battle by my side. Yet as the shock of Dr. Shaw's diagnosis began to recede, a strange, undeniable unease started to creep into my mind. I had spent 40 years surviving in the ruthless, unforgiving world of commercial freight and logistics. My entire empire was built on my ability to read people, to spot a bad deal, and to sense when a broker was lying to my face. My survival instinct was a finely tuned instrument, and right now that instinct was softly but persistently sounding an alarm in the deep recesses of my brain. Something about the swiftness of it all felt incredibly wrong. The immediate availability of a highly specialized surgeon, the complete lack of secondary testing, the sheer certainty of a 1-month timeline. It all felt less like a medical diagnosis and more like a carefully executed business transaction. We arrived at the house and Preston quickly excused himself, claiming he needed to make urgent calls to his financial advisors to liquidate his startup shares. Evelyn helped me inside, her demeanor shifting from hysterical grief to a focused, almost clinical efficiency. She instructed me to rest in the downstairs living room, while she went upstairs to prepare my bedroom for the upcoming surgical recovery. I sank into the deep leather sofa, the exhaustion pulling at my eyelids. But the unsettling feeling in my gut simply refused to fade. It gnawed at me, growing sharper with every passing minute. I needed to see my primary insurance documents. I wanted to ensure that my medical coverage was fully in order, just in case Preston's financial sacrifice fell through. I did not want my son to bankrupt his future for my sake. I stood up from the deep leather sofa. I walked quietly down the long hallway toward my private home office, leaning heavily against the paneled walls for support. The house was quiet, save for the faint rhythmic sound of heavy plastic rustling coming from the end of the hall. I approached the open doorway of my office. I stopped dead in my tracks. Evelyn was standing in the center of the room. She was not preparing a recovery space. She was dismantling my life. A massive black trash bag sat open on the floor next to my mahogany desk. With brisk sweeping motions, she was clearing out my personal belongings. I watched in absolute shock as she grabbed my weathered leather-bound trucking journals. Those journals contained 4 decades of handwritten notes, the blood and sweat history of how I built my company from a single rusted rig. She tossed them into the black plastic bag. Next went my collection of vintage watches, gifts I had received from business partners. Then she picked up a stack of old family photo albums filled with pictures of Preston as a child and memories of a lifetime we had built together. She dropped them directly into the trash bag alongside the watches and the journals. My breath caught in my throat. I could not comprehend what I was seeing. Why would she throw away my most cherished possessions? My eyes drifted past her to the surface of my desk. Neatly laid out, perfectly aligned and smoothed flat, were my life insurance policies. The paperwork for the $10 million payout was separated from my financial files, placed front and center. The stark contrast between my discarded memories in the trash bag and the meticulously arranged insurance policies on the desk was a physical blow to my chest. Evelyn suddenly turned around and froze. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine, unadulterated panic flash across her face. The mask of the grieving wife slipped, revealing a cold, calculating stranger. but she recovered with terrifying speed. She forced a warm maternal smile, her voice dropping into a soothing, patronizing register. "Victor, what are you doing out of bed?" she scolded gently, quickly stepping in front of the trash bag as if to block it from my view. "You are supposed to be resting. The doctor said you need to conserve all your energy." I pointed a trembling finger at the black plastic bag on the floor. I asked her what she was doing with my journals. I asked her why my family photo albums were being thrown away. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes grew hard. She stepped toward me, placing her hands softly on my arms. "Oh, darling," she murmured, her tone dripping with manufactured patience. "I am just decluttering." Dr. Shaw was very clear about the risk of infection after a major liver resection. "We need to create a completely sterile, dust-free recovery space for you. Those old books and albums gather so much dust and mold. We simply cannot risk your weakened immune system. I am only doing this to protect you, Victor. We have to keep this room perfectly clean for your post-operative care." She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, the picture of a devoted wife making difficult choices for the health of her dying husband. I nodded my head, pretending to accept her perfectly reasonable explanation. I forced myself to apologize for startling her, blaming my confusion on the stress of the grim diagnosis and the heavy lethargy clouding my mind. I allowed her to guide me gently back down the hallway toward the living room, leaning on her shoulder, just as a dying man would. But inside, my blood ran absolutely cold. The agonizing physical pain in my stomach was entirely eclipsed by a new, horrifying clarity. You clean a room to prepare for a recovering patient. You might wipe down surfaces, bring in medical equipment, and change the linens. But you do not throw away a man's legacy. You do not discard his life's work, his memories, and his personal history, unless you are absolutely certain he is never coming back to claim them. The tidy arrangement of the $10 million life insurance policies on the desk was the final undeniable proof. She was not preparing a room for my recovery. She was liquidating my existence. The woman I had deeply loved for 40 years was eagerly clearing the stage for my death, wiping away my history to make room for her sudden wealth. I realized my family had already buried me in their minds. The digital clock on my bedside table glared with bright red numbers, piercing the thick darkness of the room. It was exactly 2 a.m. I awoke with a sudden violent gasp, my throat feeling as though it had been scoured with coarse sandpaper. An unnatural burning thirst consumed my entire mouth, a parched sensation that felt entirely different from any normal dehydration. My tongue cleaved to the roof of my mouth, thick and tasteless. The dull, relentless throbbing in my right abdomen continued its cruel rhythm, a lingering reminder of the sudden, devastating medical crisis that had brought my world crashing down only hours earlier. I shifted my weight carefully beneath the heavy down comforter, wincing as a sharp spike of pain radiated through my core. Evelyn was softly snoring on her side of our large bed, completely undisturbed by my restless agony. Her back was turned to me, her breathing steady and rhythmic, a portrait of untroubled slumber. I stared at the back of her head for a long moment, the horrifying image of my legacy stuffed into a black trash bag replaying endlessly in my troubled mind. I needed water. More than that, I needed to escape the suffocating presence of the woman who was so eagerly anticipating my demise. I swung my heavy legs over the edge of the mattress, my bare feet touching the cold, hardwood floor. Every movement required a monumental effort. The strange, oppressive lethargy that had seized me in the kitchen earlier that day still weighed heavily on my aging bones. I grasped the edge of the mahogany nightstand, pushing myself up into a standing position. My knees popped and trembled, protesting the simple act of bearing my own weight. I steadied my breathing, taking slow, deliberate inhalations to manage the pain, and began my slow, agonizing limp toward the bedroom door. The sprawling Boston mansion, a testament to my 40 years of relentless labor on the shipping docks, was enveloped in a profound, ghostly silence. Moonlight filtered through the tall, arched windows lining the hallway, casting long, distorted shadows across the imported rugs. I navigated the familiar corridor with the slow, cautious steps of a man navigating a minefield. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its polished oak banister cool beneath my sweaty palm as I began my descent to the ground floor. Each step was a battle against my failing body, my mind completely consumed by the desperate need to quench the burning fire in my throat. I reached the bottom of the stairs and made my way toward the massive open-concept kitchen. The cool, ambient glow of the modern appliances provided the only illumination in the cavernous space. As I approached the large granite island, the exact spot where I had collapsed earlier, a sudden chill washed over me. It was not just the ambient temperature of the house. I felt a cold breeze brushing against my ankles. I stopped moving my hand, hovering inches from a crystal water glass on the counter. The heavy glass doors leading out to the rear patio were slightly ajar, allowing the crisp, salty night air rolling in from the Boston harbor to slip inside. Through the narrow gap, I heard a voice. It was a hushed, furious whisper, tight with a desperate, frantic energy. I recognized that voice instantly. It was my son. It was Preston. He was pacing back and forth on the stone terrace, his silhouette partially illuminated by the faint glow of the outdoor security lights. I pressed my back flat against the cold kitchen wall, holding my breath, my thirst completely forgotten. I edged closer to the slightly opened door, keeping myself perfectly hidden within the deep shadows of the kitchen. Preston was holding his cell phone tightly against his ear, his free hand running anxiously through his hair. He sounded incredibly agitated, entirely different from the composed, loving son who had promised to save my life just hours prior. I strained my ears to catch his words over the gentle rustling of the wind through the coastal trees. He was arguing with someone on the other end of the line, his tone defensive and impatient. "I do not care about the logistical delays," Preston hissed venomously into the receiver, his voice slicing through the quiet night. "I told you the O-negative cargo is locked in. The harvest is next Thursday. Tell the Silicon Valley buyer to have the $5 million in crypto ready to transfer. We are not negotiating the price at this stage. It is a perfect match, completely clean, and the timeline is set." He paused, listening to the person on the other end, his jaw clenching with visible tension. "Yes, the doctor is on board. The clinical setting is fully prepped and sterile. There will be no complications and there will be no paper trail. Just make sure the escrow account is funded by Monday morning, or the deal is entirely off." I stood frozen in the absolute darkness of my kitchen, my back pressed so hard against the wall that the plaster felt like it was bruising my spine. The world around me seemed to stop spinning, plunging into a terrifying vacuum like silence. The words echoed in my mind, over and over, growing louder and more devastating with every repetition. "The O-negative cargo is locked in. The harvest is next Thursday. Tell the Silicon Valley buyer to have the $5 million in crypto ready. O-negative." I closed my eyes, my entire body breaking into a violent, uncontrollable tremble. O-negative is an incredibly rare blood type. It is the universal donor type. It is my blood type. The horrifying realization slammed into my chest with the unstoppable, crushing force of a runaway freight train. The puzzle pieces scattered and confusing until this very moment began to violently snap together in my mind, forming a picture so vile, so incomprehensibly wicked, that my brain initially refused to accept it. I thought about Preston's failing venture capital business, the mounting rumors of his staggering debts, and his recent requests for massive cash infusions. I thought about the sudden, highly convenient onset of my debilitating symptoms, perfectly timed with Monica's new morning health juice routine. I thought about Dr. Gregory Shaw, his sleek, unblemished private clinic, and the incredibly blurry, unsubstantiated scan that had instantly condemned me to a rapid death. There had been no secondary tests, no blood work reviewed in my presence, no second opinions allowed. The bizarre urgency of scheduling a highly complex surgery within days was not a desperate medical attempt to save a dying father. It was a strict delivery deadline for a black market transaction. They were not planning to remove a cancerous tumor to prolong my life. They were planning to cut me open, harvest my perfectly healthy organs, and sell them to the highest bidder to erase Preston's gambling debts. My own flesh and blood, the boy I had raised, loved, and protected, had placed a $5 million price tag on my life. The pain in my abdomen suddenly felt entirely different. It was the sharp, undeniable sting of absolute premeditated murder. I stood frozen against the cold kitchen plaster for an eternity long after Preston had ended his call and slid the patio doors shut. His footsteps faded up the grand staircase, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of the house I had built. My mind was a chaotic storm of betrayal and horror, but my survival instincts locked my physical reactions in an iron grip. I did not confront him. I did not scream. Instead, I forced my trembling legs to carry me back upstairs, slipping quietly beneath the heavy comforter beside my sleeping wife. I stared at the ceiling until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the bedroom blinds. I had to play the part of the dying patriarch perfectly. If they suspected for even a single second that I knew about the organ harvest, they would not wait for the surgical table. They would silence me right here in my own bed without any hesitation. At exactly 8 o'clock, the bedroom door creaked open. Monica strolled in, her face arranged in a mask of radiant artificial sunshine. She wore a pristine white athletic outfit, her hair pulled back, looking every bit the devoted daughter-in-law. In her hands, she carried a silver tray bearing a tall glass of her custom-blended protein shake. The thick gray sludge looked entirely innocent, but my stomach recoiled at the sight of it. "Good morning, Victor," she cooed softly, placing the tray on my nightstand with practiced care. "You need to keep your strength up for the surgery next week. Dr. Shaw said your nutrition is absolutely vital right now to ensure a smooth operation." I looked into her bright, welcoming eyes, searching for any trace of guilt, any subtle crack in her caring facade. There was absolutely nothing to be found. She possessed the chilling, sociopathic ability to smile warmly at a man she was actively helping to murder. I slowly pushed myself up against the headboard, forcing my lips to curve into a weak, grateful smile. "Thank you, Monica," I rasped, making sure my voice sounded as frail and broken as they expected it to be. "You are taking such incredibly good care of me." She handed me the cold glass, her fingers briefly brushing against mine. I brought the rim to my lips, tipping the thick liquid into my mouth. The chalky, bitter taste flooded my tongue, sending a massive wave of revulsion through my system. But I did not swallow a single drop. I let the sludge pool inside my cheeks, then immediately descended into a violent coughing fit. I doubled over, pressing my free hand against my chest, hacking loudly as if my lungs were failing. Monica gasped, stepping back hastily to avoid any potential mess on her clothing. I grabbed a thick towel from the bedside table, bringing it to my face to cover my mouth. Under the guise of wiping my chin, I discreetly spat the mouthful of toxic shake into the dark folds of the towel. "Oh my goodness, Victor, are you all right?" she asked, hovering near the foot of the bed. Just a sudden tickle in my throat, I wheezed, keeping the towel firmly in place. "Could you please fetch me a fresh bottle of water from the downstairs refrigerator? The tap water upstairs always tastes a bit metallic to me and makes me nauseous." Monica nodded eagerly, completely oblivious to my deception, and hurried out of the room. The moment her footsteps faded down the hall, I grabbed an empty insulated thermos from my bag on the floor. I quickly wrung the gray liquid from the towel into the metal container, then poured the remaining contents of the glass directly into the thermos. I screwed the lid on tight and shoved it deep under my clothes. When Monica returned with the water a minute later, I was sitting back against the pillows, holding the empty glass. I smiled weakly, thanking her for the refreshing drink. She beamed with profound satisfaction, taking the empty glass from my trembling hands, completely convinced that I had just ingested another lethal dose of poison. She left the room shortly after, promising to check on me around noon to see how I felt. I sat alone in the quiet bedroom, waiting for the inevitable agony to strike. I waited for the searing fire in my abdomen, the liquid weakness in my bones, the mental fog that usually stole my mornings. An hour passed in absolute silence. Then 2 hours ticked by. The clock in the hallway chimed 10 times. The intense, crippling lethargy never arrived. My mind remained incredibly sharp, clear, and totally focused on the harsh reality around me. The dull throbbing in my liver, while mildly uncomfortable, did not escalate into the blinding cramps that had dropped me to the kitchen floor the previous day. The connection was undeniable, solidifying the horrific truth deeply into my conscious mind. I was not dying of an aggressive tumor. My organs were not failing due to natural causes or a sudden terrible disease. My symptoms were entirely manufactured by the people I trusted. Every single morning, Monica had been feeding me a carefully calibrated cocktail of toxins, likely heavy immunosuppressants mixed with trace amounts of arsenic, designed to mimic the exact symptoms of acute liver failure. They needed me to look sick, to feel sick, to convince the outside world that my impending death on the surgical table was a tragic but expected medical outcome. As my physical strength slowly returned without the poison circulating through my veins, the pieces of Preston's desperation locked into place. I remembered the hushed rumors I had heard echoing through the financial district months ago, rumors I had stubbornly dismissed as gossip. Whispers that Preston's venture capital firm was hemorrhaging money at a terrifying rate. Talk of reckless investments, massive margin calls, and a liquidity crisis he could not escape. More chillingly, there were dark murmurs about where he turned when legitimate banks cut him off. He borrowed heavily from the underground, dealing with ruthless loan sharks connected to the cartels. These men did not accept apologies or bankruptcy filings to settle accounts. They demanded their money, and they did not care how it was obtained. Preston was drowning in a multi-million-dollar debt that would cost his life if he defaulted. He needed an immediate massive influx of untraceable cash. And right in his own family, he had a father with a rare O-negative blood type, a biological goldmine for the black market trade. I sat on the edge of my bed, gripping the bed sheets as calculating rage replaced my grief. I was not a beloved patriarch fighting a tragic illness. I was nothing more than a walking bank account to them, a biological asset being fattened up and chemically manipulated by my own family. They were smiling at my face while eagerly prepping me for the slaughterhouse. They thought I was a weak, dying old man who would quietly bleed out on Dr. Shaw's table. They severely underestimated the man they were dealing with, and I was going to make them pay. The burning fury inside me crystallized into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I stood up, leaving behind the facade of the frail, dying patriarch. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the familiar heavy strength return to my muscles. For a month, I had allowed my family to manipulate me, to poison me, and to strip away my dignity. I had been foolish enough to let paternal love blind me to the ruthless reality of their greed. But I did not build a freight empire by being a victim. I survived in a cutthroat industry because I knew how to outsmart and outmaneuver anyone. Preston and Evelyn had forgotten who I was. They forgot that beneath my gray hair was a man who knew exactly how to wage a war. It was time to remind them. I needed to leave the house without raising suspicion. Grabbing my wooden cane, I forced my posture to slump. I practiced the labored, agonizing shuffle that Evelyn and Monica had come to expect. I descended the stairs, coughing. Evelyn was in the formal dining room, reviewing fabric swatches for funeral arrangements. She looked up as I entered the hallway, her expression instantly shifting into exaggerated sympathy. I told her in a weak, breathless whisper that I was feeling incredibly claustrophobic and needed a short, slow walk to clear my lungs before my scheduled afternoon nap. I assured her I would only go as far as the small public park at the end of our exclusive gated street. She hesitated, calculating if this ruined her pristine timeline, but quickly smiled. She told me to take my time, but to avoid exhausting my failing heart. The moment I stepped out of the heavy iron gates of our estate and turned the corner out of view, the stooped, dying old man vanished. I stood up straight. I gripped the cane like a weapon. I walked with a brisk, powerful stride, my mind entirely focused on the mission ahead. I did not go to the manicured neighborhood park. I hailed a yellow city taxi to the industrial district. I needed to meet someone who lived far outside the polished, deceitful world of Lincoln Park luxury. I needed a man who understood the dark, violent underbelly of the city. I arrived at a dilapidated diner wedged beside an abandoned auto body shop. The heavy air here tasted of toxic diesel fumes and damp asphalt, a familiar scent that instantly brought back sharp, vivid memories of my grueling early days working endlessly on the shipping docks. I pushed open the greasy glass door. The diner was nearly empty, smelling strongly of stale coffee and fried onions. Sitting alone in a shadowed corner booth was Detective Arthur Gallagher. He was a heavily built man with a thick, graying beard and sharp, observant eyes that missed nothing. Gallagher was a former Boston police detective, a gritty, relentless investigator whose career I had saved 20 years ago when a corrupt city official tried to frame him for an evidence scandal. I had used my corporate lawyers and private security funds to expose the real culprit, clearing Gallagher's name and preserving his pension. He had solemnly promised that if I ever needed a massive favor, he would always deliver. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. Gallagher took one look at my face and set his coffee mug down. He did not ask how I was doing, or offer hollow sympathies about my supposed terminal illness. He knew me too well for that. He simply asked what I needed. I silently pulled out the heavy stainless steel thermos. I placed it firmly on the table. I told him that inside this container was the daily health juice my loving daughter-in-law had been forcing down my throat for the past month. I explained that it contained a slow-acting, debilitating poison designed to mimic acute liver failure. Gallagher's eyes narrowed with dangerous anger. He reached out and pulled the thermos toward him, wrapping his large hands around the cold metal. I did not explain the betrayal. I just laid out the cold, hard facts of the assassination attempt. I leaned across the table, lowering my voice so the lone waitress wiping down the counter could not hear. I told him everything. I told him about Preston's failing venture capital firm and the desperate rumors of massive debts owed to underground loan sharks. I told him about the sudden midnight phone call on the patio, the explicit mention of an negative harvest scheduled for next Thursday, and the $5 million cryptocurrency transfer waiting in escrow. Gallagher did not interrupt. He absorbed every single detail, his mind already working through the logistical network of the black market organ trade. When I finished, he let out a low, grim whistle, shaking his head in absolute disgust. He told me that this level of coordination required a highly sophisticated medical front. It was not a back-alley butchery. It was a sterile corporate execution. I nodded, pulling a folded piece of paper from my pocket. I handed it to him. On the paper, I had written the name Dr. Gregory Shaw and the address of the discreet luxury clinic in the northern suburbs. I gave Gallagher his orders. I wanted a complete, aggressive deep dive into the Shaw Institute. I needed to know exactly who funded the clinic, who sat on their board, and every single missing persons case connected to their staff. I instructed him to follow the money flowing into Preston's offshore accounts. I wanted the true identity of the Silicon Valley buyer, who had put a $5 million bounty on my liver. Most importantly, I needed to know exactly which cartel or loan shark held the leash around my son's neck. I told Gallagher to spare absolutely no expense. He could use all the financial resources, bribes, and brutal intimidation tactics he deemed necessary. I wanted every dark secret dragged out into the daylight. Gallagher folded the piece of paper and tucked it carefully into his breast pocket alongside the metal thermos. He looked at me with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that I had foolishly expected from my own family. He promised me he would have a comprehensive, undeniable dossier within 48 hours. He asked me what I planned to do in the meantime, returning to a house filled with people actively conspiring to murder me in cold blood. I looked out the dirty diner window at the gray, overcast sky. I told him I was going to do what I do best. I was going to play the game. I was going to return to that mansion, accept their fake tears, and let them believe their flawless plan was perfectly on track. I would let them push me right up to the very edge of the surgical table. But when the time came, they would not find a helpless victim waiting for the knife. They would find a man who had already bought their executioners and locked all the doors. I stood up slowly from the cracked vinyl booth, ready to initiate the final phase of my revenge. I stepped out of the greasy diner and into the crisp afternoon air, leaving the toxic scent of the industrial district behind me. My stride remained firm and steady until I approached the towering iron gates of my private estate. The moment I crossed that threshold, I forced my shoulders to slump, dragging my feet in a shuffle to maintain the illusion of my failing health. The next 48 hours were an excruciating exercise in psychological endurance. I had to smile weakly at Evelyn as she flitted around the house organizing my impending funeral arrangements under the guise of deep cleaning. I had to look directly into Preston's eyes and express profound gratitude every time he updated me on his fictitious efforts to liquidate his non-existent startup shares. Every morning I accepted the heavy glass of gray sludge from Monica, repeatedly thanking her for her selfless devotion. The routine remained identical. I would take the glass, pretend to struggle with my breathing, and discreetly spit the toxic cocktail into the hidden thermos the moment she turned her back. Without the poison actively attacking my nervous system, my physical strength was completely restored. My mind was sharper than it had been in years. Yet the emotional toll of living quietly among my executioners felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I spent long hours lying perfectly still in my dark bedroom, listening to their muffled, joyful laughter echoing from the downstairs living room. They were already spending the $5 million in their heads, completely unaware that their biological bank account was lying upstairs, wide awake and listening. On the morning of the third day, my burner phone vibrated silently in my jacket pocket. It was a single text message from Detective Gallagher, containing a discreet address for a bleak, abandoned marina located on the extreme south side of the city. I played the pathetic part of the dying man for my eager family, claiming I needed to visit my old attorney to finalize some minor estate details before the upcoming surgery. Evelyn eagerly encouraged the trip, practically pushing me out the front door with a fake, sorrowful smile. I took a highly cautious, winding route through the dense city traffic, deliberately changing taxis twice to ensure I was not being followed, before finally arriving at the desolate waterfront. The wind, howling off the dark harbor, was bitterly cold, violently whipping up whitecaps on the choppy water. Detective Gallagher was patiently waiting for me inside his unmarked sedan, the powerful engine idling quietly. I climbed slowly into the passenger seat, the heavy reinforced doors securely sealing us inside a soundproof vault. He did not offer a polite greeting. His rugged face was deeply etched with a profound, unsettling grimness that immediately sent a fresh chill down my aging spine. He reached silently into the back seat and retrieved a thick manila folder, placing it heavily onto the dashboard, exactly between us. He told me that he had aggressively called in several major favors with an exclusive private forensic laboratory to expedite the chemical analysis of the suspicious liquid I had provided. He had also managed to obtain the preliminary blood panels drawn by Dr. Shaw's corrupt clinic, entirely bypassing their secure digital servers through an old police contact. Gallagher looked at me, his rough voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. He tapped the manila folder with a thick, calloused finger and stated the absolute, undeniable truth. There was no cancer. He repeated the words slowly, ensuring they penetrated the lingering shock floating in my mind. The authentic blood panels securely recovered from the Shaw Institute showed absolutely zero biological markers for any oncological anomalies. My liver was perfectly healthy, functioning with the robust vitality of a man 20 years younger. Gallagher then opened the folder, slowly revealing the detailed toxicology breakdown of Monica's daily health juice. The chemical composition was horrifyingly precise. The thick gray sludge was heavily laced with dangerous microdoses of arsenic, carefully measured to completely avoid sudden fatal toxicity. It was deliberately paired with a massive concentration of heavy black market immunosuppressants and targeted neurotoxins. Detective Gallagher slowly explained the malicious, calculated genius hiding behind the specific chemical cocktail. The arsenic actively caused the searing, agonizing abdominal cramps and the severe lethargy, perfectly simulating the exact clinical presentation of acute liver failure. The heavy immunosuppressants completely crashed my natural defenses, brilliantly creating the pale, sickly appearance that entirely convinced everyone I was rapidly deteriorating. But the absolute most terrifying aspect of the insidious poison was its flawless surgical precision. The diverse toxins were explicitly formulated to inflict maximum human pain and massive systemic shock without causing a single trace of necrotic damage to the actual liver tissue itself. They were ruthlessly torturing me violently, breaking down my body and my weary spirit while purposefully keeping the coveted organ entirely pristine and viable for surgical harvest. They desperately needed the liver completely intact to safely collect their $5 million cryptocurrency payout. The suffocating agony of that realization hit me harder than any physical blow I had ever received. I sat paralyzed in the passenger seat of the idling sedan, staring blankly at the typed words on the laboratory report. The terminology detailed the method of my intended execution. My hands began to shake violently, not from the lingering poison, but from a grief so deep and absolute that it felt as though my heart was being physically torn from my chest. I thought about the grueling decades I had spent inhaling toxic diesel exhaust, driving through freezing winter blizzards, and working until my hands bled, all to ensure Preston never had to struggle. I thought about the gentle way I used to hold him when he was a child, promising to fiercely protect him from the cruel world. I thought about Evelyn, the woman I had built a beautiful home with, the woman who had smiled at me across 1,000 warm dinner tables. And I thought about Monica, who looked me directly in the eyes every single morning with a warm, caring smile as she handed me a tall glass of concentrated death. The people I had bled for, the family I had devoted my entire existence to, were methodically, scientifically poisoning me for profit. They were not acting out of a sudden, desperate panic. This was a cold, brilliantly calculated, meticulously planned assassination. They had researched the lethal toxins, willingly partnered with a deeply corrupt medical facility, and negotiated a lucrative black market price for my living flesh. The sheer incomprehensible evil of their monstrous actions completely swallowed all the air inside the cramped car. I closed my eyes, letting the crushing weight of the absolute betrayal wash completely over me. The sorrow was utterly unbearable, a dark, endless abyss. But as the silent seconds painfully ticked by in the vehicle, the bottomless grief slowly began to solidify. The sorrow froze entirely, rapidly hardening into something infinitely more dangerous. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Detective Gallagher. The tears had completely stopped. The weakness was permanently gone. There was only absolute vengeance left in my fractured soul. Gallagher dropped me off 3 blocks from my estate. I walked the rest of the way, letting the biting Boston wind prepare me for the performance of a lifetime. By the time I reached the Grand Iron Gates, I was no longer the furious, vengeful man who had just uncovered a murder plot. I was the fragile, dying patriarch, completely dependent on the mercy of his loving family. As I shuffled up the long, curving driveway, I saw Preston's sleek black Mercedes parked near the portico. He was standing by the open trunk, typing on his cell phone, his brow furrowed in deep frustration. He looked up as I approached, quickly shoving the phone into his tailored suit jacket and plastering on his trademark mask of filial devotion. He rushed forward to meet me, chiding me gently for walking too far and risking my rapidly failing health. I leaned heavily into his arms, letting out a convincing, ragged wheeze. I thanked him, my voice trembling with manufactured weakness. I told him the fresh air had done me good, but the short walk had entirely drained my remaining energy. He wrapped his arm around my waist, guiding me toward the passenger side of his vehicle to rest for a moment before tackling the front steps. This was my window of opportunity. Gallagher had given me more than just the toxicology report at the diner. He had also supplied me with a miniature military-grade audio transmitter, a tiny magnetic device no larger than a button, designed to broadcast crystal-clear sound over a secure cellular frequency. It was resting securely in the sweaty palm of my right hand, ready to be deployed. As Preston helped me slide onto the edge of the leather passenger seat, I purposely let my body weight sag. I feigned a sudden severe dizzy spell, gripping the door frame tightly and letting my head fall forward. My house keys slipped from my weakened fingers, clattering loudly against the running board before bouncing deep underneath the passenger seat. Preston immediately stepped back, his hands hovering uselessly as he asked if he needed to call Dr. Shaw. I waved him off with a trembling hand, whispering that I just needed a few seconds to catch my breath and gather my dropped keys. Before he could offer to retrieve them, I slid off the edge of the seat and dropped heavily to my knees on the paved driveway. I reached my arm deep into the dark, narrow space beneath the luxury leather seat. My fingers located the metallic ring of my keys, but my palm pressed the tiny magnetic transmitter firmly against the solid steel rail of the seat frame. I held it there for 3 seconds, ensuring the powerful magnet clamped down with an unbreakable grip. The device was now completely invisible, flawlessly positioned to capture every single word spoken inside that cabin. I pulled my hand out, clutching the keys, and let Preston haul my dead weight back up to a standing position. I smiled up at him, my eyes shining with fake gratitude as I thanked him for his unending patience. He gently patted my back, completely unaware that he had just allowed a deadly Trojan horse into his most private sanctuary. The next 48 hours were an agonizing exercise in psychological torture. I had fought ruthless competitors and navigated massive financial crises, but nothing compared to the sheer mental endurance required to live quietly among my eager executioners. I spent my days confined to the downstairs living room, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, playing the role of the rapidly deteriorating invalid. Every morning, Monica would glide into the room, her face glowing with radiant warmth. She would hand me the tall glass of gray sludge, whispering sweet words of encouragement about my nutritional needs. I would look her directly in the eyes, squeeze her hand affectionately, and thank her from the bottom of my dying heart. Then the moment she turned away to adjust the window blinds, I would quickly spit the toxic arsenic-laced poison into my hidden steel thermos. Evelyn was even worse. She spent her afternoons sitting on the edge of my sofa, holding my hand and weeping softly into her expensive silk handkerchief. She would stroke my hair and tell me how incredibly brave I was, while seamlessly bringing up the location of my safe deposit box keys and the exact contact information for my estate attorneys. I held her hand right back. I wiped her false tears from her cheeks. I murmured comforting reassurances, promising her that everything would be taken care of and that she would never have to worry about a single financial burden. I smiled at my wife and my arrogant daughter-in-law feeding their monstrous egos while a cold, absolute hatred burned brightly like a dying star in my chest. But the true torture began at night when the house finally grew silent. I would lie awake in the suffocating darkness of my bedroom, a small, discreet earpiece hidden firmly in my right ear. The audio transmitter planted in Preston's Mercedes broadcasted directly to my burner phone, giving me an unfiltered, terrifying window into my son's desperate, crumbling world. I listened as he drove through the city, his voice echoing in the quiet cabin of his car. I heard him making frantic, furious phone calls to offshore banking contacts, desperately trying to shield the incoming $5 million cryptocurrency transfer from federal tax audits. I listened to his conversations with Dr. Gregory Shaw, discussing my fabricated medical charts and confirming the exact surgical schedule for the impending organ harvest. The sheer clinical detachment in their voices was horrifying. They spoke about my liver, my blood type, and my physical dimensions as if I were a piece of valuable, inanimate cargo being prepped for overseas shipping. There was no hesitation, no moral conflict, and absolutely no remorse. But the most devastating transmissions were the calls Preston made to Evelyn. I lay in my bed, separated from my wife by only a few inches of mattress, listening to her voice clearly over the encrypted feed. She complained to our son about how long the poison was taking to incapacitate me, She whined about the tedious chore of pretending to care for me explicitly, stating that she could not wait to book her extended luxury vacations to the French Riviera once the insurance payout cleared. Hearing the sheer, unadulterated evil dripping from her casual words shattered the final lingering illusions I held about my marriage. The woman sleeping peacefully beside me was an absolute monster. The son I had sacrificed everything for was a remorseless, calculating butcher. They had systematically stripped away my humanity, reducing my lifetime of love and provision to a simple, bloody transaction. I absorbed every venomous word, burning their confessions into my memory. The pain of their betrayal was excruciating, but it was also the ultimate fuel for my revenge. I was no longer a father or a husband. I was a predator, patiently waiting in the tall grass, holding the trap perfectly still until the moment was right to snap it shut. The sun rose on the fourth day, casting a pale light across the manicured lawns of my estate. I maintained my grueling performance, shuffling down to the kitchen to accept my morning dose of poison from Monica. I executed the familiar routine, coughing, violently masking my face with a towel, and depositing the toxic sludge into my hidden thermos. Evelyn watched me from the kitchen island, sipping her black coffee, silently calculating how many more mornings she would have to endure this theatrical display of my suffering. I smiled at her, reflecting the hollow gratitude of a dying man, before excusing myself to rest in my study. Once safely behind the heavy oak doors, I pulled the burner phone from my jacket pocket. Detective Gallagher was calling on the encrypted line. I answered immediately. Detective Gallagher demanded that I directly meet him at a highly secure location, an abandoned warehouse district on the outskirts of the city, far away from the prying eyes of Lincoln Park and Preston's thugs. I managed to slip out through the service entrance, moving with the brisk, powerful strides of a man who had fully reclaimed his vitality. The drive to the warehouse district was a blur of gray concrete. I found Gallagher waiting inside a cavernous, empty storage facility, the ambient light filtering through broken skylights high above. He was standing next to a makeshift table fashioned from stacked wooden pallets, several thick dossiers spread out before him. The grim, haunted look in his eyes had deepened significantly. I approached the table, my footsteps echoing loudly against the concrete floor. Gallagher looked up slowly, pushing a massive stack of heavily redacted documents toward me. He took a deep breath, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a heavy sigh, and began to unravel the absolute horrifying truth behind the Shaw Institute. Dr. Gregory Shaw was not a brilliant medical specialist dedicated to saving the lives of the elite. He was a highly sophisticated butcher operating one of the most lucrative and illicit organ trafficking rings on the eastern seaboard. Gallagher explained that the pristine, luxurious clinic in the wooded suburbs was nothing more than a brilliantly constructed front. It was designed to lure in desperate, wealthy clients who required immediate transplants but lacked the biological matches or the time to wait on the legitimate National Transplant Registry. Shaw catered exclusively to the ultra-rich, utilizing a vast, heavily guarded network of corrupt surgeons, forged medical records, and brutal acquisitions. They sourced organs through coercion kidnapping and family-facilitated murder. The clinic operated entirely outside the boundaries of international medical law, functioning as a high-tech slaughterhouse for the highest bidders on the dark web. I stared at the documents, the sheer scale of the monstrous operation chilling my blood. Gallagher leaned forward, tapping a specific page detailing a series of heavily encrypted financial transfers. He had tracked the digital footprints of Preston's midnight negotiations. He revealed the identity of the buyer who was waiting so eagerly for my O-negative liver. It was not a faceless medical institution. It was a dying, desperate tech billionaire located in the heart of Silicon Valley. This man was suffering from end-stage liver failure, his body rapidly breaking down. He had the immense wealth to buy absolutely anything in the world, except the time required to legally obtain a matching organ through the highly regulated national system. Preston bypassed the legal framework, utilizing his failing venture capital connections to quietly broker a deal with the billionaire's fixers. The agreed-upon purchase price was staggering: $5 million. The funds were not moving through traditional banking channels. The tech billionaire had already placed the $5 million into a highly secure, decentralized cryptocurrency escrow account. The digital currency was primed and waiting completely untraceable by standard law enforcement agencies. The instant Dr. Shaw confirmed its pristine viability, the cryptographic keys would be released instantly, transferring the massive fortune directly into Preston's hidden offshore accounts. My life, my decades of hard work, my unwavering love and support for my family had been coldly calculated and valued at exactly $5 million. I asked Gallagher the final, most devastating question. I needed to know exactly why Preston was willing to commit such an unspeakable atrocity against his own father. I knew his venture capital firm was failing, but bankruptcy was a financial loss, not a death sentence. Gallagher pulled out the final dossier, his face grim with absolute disgust. He outlined the terrifying reality of Preston's hidden life. My son had not just made poor investments. He had developed a severe, crippling gambling addiction, attempting to cover his massive corporate losses by placing astronomical bets through illegal offshore sports books. When he inevitably lost, he turned to a highly dangerous, extremely violent criminal cartel operating out of the southern border. These ruthless loan sharks had advanced him millions of dollars. Gallagher showed me a series of intercepted communications. The cartel had issued a final ultimatum. If Preston did not produce the full $5 million by the end of the month, they were going to systematically dismantle his life. They explicitly threatened to torture and kill Evelyn Monica, and finally Preston himself. My son was backed into a corner by monsters of his own making. Instead of coming to me, instead of confessing his sins and begging for financial protection, he had chosen the path of ultimate betrayal. He looked at his aging father and saw nothing but a convenient biological asset. He decided to sacrifice my life to save his own skin, dragging his mother and his wife into the murderous conspiracy. I stood in the warehouse, the silence stretching endlessly as the horrific reality settled completely into my bones. The family I had bled for, the empire I had built to ensure their comfort, was entirely built on a foundation of rotting lies. My wife was eagerly anticipating my death to fund her lavish vacations. My daughter-in-law was methodically feeding me poison every single morning with a caring smile. And my only son, the boy I had protected from the world, had sold my internal organs to a desperate billionaire to pay off cartel killers. The agony of that treason threatened to tear my mind apart. But I refused to break. I felt the last lingering threads of my paternal love completely sever, snapping like fragile glass under immense pressure. The man who had loved them unconditionally was now dead, murdered by their own hands. In his place stood a ruthless survivor who had spent 40 years crushing competitors in the freight industry. I looked at Detective Gallagher, my voice steady and cold as steel. I told him we were going to war. We would let Preston bring me to the surgical table at the Shaw Institute. We would let the billionaire transfer the money. We would let the conspiracy expose itself perfectly. And then I would systematically destroy every single person who had conspired to put me deep in the cold ground. I would ensure that they lost absolutely everything they valued before I finally sent them to the prison cells they so rightfully deserved. The waiting was a masterclass in psychological endurance. I had spent my entire life building, moving, and creating tangible results. But now my greatest weapon was absolute motionless silence. I sat alone in the profound darkness of my private study, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly against the Boston night. The grandfather clock down the hall chimed a hollow rhythmic beat, marking the passage of time in a house that felt increasingly like a mausoleum. My burner phone sat flat on the polished mahogany desk, its small screen casting a pale, unnatural glow across my folded hands. The discreet military-grade earpiece was wedged securely in my right ear, providing a crystal-clear audio link to the miniature transmitter clamped beneath the passenger seat of Preston's luxury sedan. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, perfectly still, breathing shallowly as I monitored the digital feed. For hours, there had been nothing but the ambient, muffled sounds of downtown traffic and the low hum of the German engine. Preston had left the estate earlier that afternoon, with Evelyn claiming they needed to finalize some complicated medical directives with my estate attorneys. I knew exactly where they were truly going. Detective Gallagher had sent me a brief encrypted text confirming that my wife and son had walked into the premier branch of our primary financial institution just before closing time. They were preparing the offshore accounts to receive the blood money. The audio feed suddenly crackled with a burst of static, followed by the distinct, heavy thud of two car doors slamming shut. The engine roared to life, a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the tiny speaker in my ear. I leaned forward in my leather chair, closing my eyes to focus entirely on the transmitted sound. The rhythmic clicking of a turn signal echoed through the cabin, followed by the smooth acceleration of the vehicle merging onto the highway. For several long minutes, there was only the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Then Preston spoke. His voice was no longer masked by the frantic, panicked desperation I had heard during his midnight balcony call. It was calm, measured, and terrifyingly arrogant. He let out a long, heavy sigh of relief, stating that the banking manager had successfully verified the routing numbers for the offshore shell company. He casually mentioned that the Silicon Valley buyer had officially locked the $5 million cryptocurrency transfer into the digital escrow account. The cartel had been notified. The violent loan sharks holding the leash around his neck had graciously agreed to pause their physical threats, satisfied that their massive payday was entirely guaranteed by the end of the upcoming week. Preston sounded victorious, like a young corporate executive who had just closed the most lucrative merger of his entire career. Evelyn responded, and the sheer glacial coldness in her tone made my breath catch in my throat. This was not the weeping devoted wife who spent her afternoons stroking my hair and mourning my fabricated diagnosis. Her voice was sharp, steady, and dripping with a venomous impatience I had never heard in our 4 decades of marriage. She dismissed Preston's financial victory with a harsh click of her tongue, steering the conversation toward the darkest, most vile aspect of their conspiracy. She demanded to know if Preston had explicitly finalized the surgical parameters with Dr. Gregory Shaw. She wanted absolute, undeniable confirmation that the extraction procedure would be permanent. Preston chuckled, a wet, sickening sound that made my stomach churn with pure revulsion. He assured his mother that the clinic director perfectly understood the grim assignment. He explained that removing the right lobe of the liver was a highly invasive, incredibly delicate procedure, particularly for a man of my advanced age. It would be remarkably easy, he noted casually, for a sudden, tragic hemorrhage to occur on the operating table. The medical records were already falsified to show an aggressive terminal cancer. A sudden cardiac arrest during an emergency resection would not trigger a single suspicious question from the National Medical Board. I sat in the dark, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached, listening as my wife delivered her final, unforgiving verdict. She leaned across the center console, her voice dropping into a lethal, commanding whisper that cut through the ambient road noise like a serrated blade. "Make sure Shaw induces a fatal complication during the extraction," Evelyn demanded, her words devoid of any human empathy. "You take the $5 million for your cartel debts, but I get his $10 million life insurance payout." She paused, the silence in the car stretching for a horrifying second. "I am not spending my golden years playing nurse to a crippled old contractor." The word contractor hung in the air, a final vicious insult aimed directly at my soul. After 40 years of providing her with a sprawling mansion, luxury vehicles, and a life of absolute unbothered privilege, she still viewed me as nothing more than the grease-stained blue-collar laborer I was when we first met. She despised the very sweat that had built her empire. Preston did not defend me. He did not hesitate. He simply agreed with her, stating that the $10 million insurance payout would clear in less than 30 days, providing her with more than enough capital to permanently relocate to the Mediterranean coast. The audio feed continued to broadcast their casual banter regarding overseas real estate and luxury travel itineraries, but I had stopped listening to the specifics. I reached up and slowly pulled the earpiece from my ear, setting it down gently on the surface of the mahogany desk. The profound silence of the study rushed back in, but the deafening roar of their betrayal continued to echo endlessly inside my skull. The very last microscopic shred of paternal affection and marital devotion I possessed instantly turned to solid, unbreakable ice. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, agonizing sorrow that had threatened to consume me only days ago was completely eradicated, replaced by a terrible, absolute clarity. They thought I was a foolish, dying old man, a convenient biological resource to be slaughtered and discarded for their financial salvation. They believed their flawless, sophisticated plan was perfectly insulated from consequences. I slowly stood up from my leather chair, my posture straight, my muscles tight with renewed lethal energy. I looked around the dark office, staring at the walls built by my own relentless labor. I truly was a contractor. I knew exactly how to build an unbreakable foundation, and I knew exactly how to demolish a structure with explosive, devastating precision. I slowly walked over to the tall, arched window and stared out at the dark, sprawling grounds of my estate. I silently vowed to the cold Boston night that I would not simply stop their surgical execution. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire existence. I would let them walk straight into their own carefully constructed trap. I would lock the doors behind them, watch them realize their monumental failure, and then without a single ounce of mercy, I would burn their deceitful world to ash. The morning of the surgery arrived with a cold, relentless rain washing over the Boston streets. I sat in the back seat of Preston's luxury sedan, wrapped in a heavy cashmere blanket, staring out the tinted windows at the gray city slipping past. The drive to the Shaw Institute was filled with a thick, suffocating silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the soft classical music Evelyn had selected to soothe my supposedly failing nerves. We pulled up to the clinic, a sleek modern fortress of reflective glass and polished steel, nestled discreetly within a heavily wooded, affluent suburb. It looked less like a medical facility and more like an exclusive corporate retreat. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed forward to open our doors with practiced deference. Preston gently gripped my elbow, supporting my manufactured dead weight as I performed my agonizing, shuffling walk through the grand marble-floored lobby. The receptionist greeted us by name, offering a sympathetic smile that felt rehearsed and entirely hollow. I was immediately escorted to a private, luxurious, preoperative suite that resembled a five-star hotel room, complete with plush seating, warm lighting, and a panoramic view of the manicured grounds. A pair of nurses efficiently helped me change into a sterile surgical gown attaching a blood pressure cuff and a heart monitor to my arm. I lay back against the pristine white pillows, slowing my breathing to mimic a man hovering on the absolute brink of total physical collapse. The trap was perfectly set, and the prey walked in. Preston, Evelyn, and Monica entered the room shortly after, initiating a sickeningly touching display of familial affection that would have won them every theatrical award in existence. Evelyn rushed to the side of the bed, her face a masterclass in fabricated tragic grief. She clutched my hand tightly in both of hers, pressing it to her cheek, as perfectly timed tears spilled from her eyes. She kissed my forehead, repeatedly, sobbing softly, and whispering how deeply she loved me, how terrifying this ordeal was, and how we were going to spend the rest of our lives together once I recovered. I looked into her tear-filled eyes, summoning every ounce of willpower to prevent myself from ripping my hand away. I forced my lips to tremble, projecting the image of a terrified but brave patriarch. I told her I loved her too, my voice a weak, pathetic rasp. Preston stood at the foot of the bed, resting his hand heavily on my ankle. He offered a firm, encouraging nod, his handsome face arranged into a mask of stoic concern. He promised me that Dr. Shaw was the absolute best in the country, that the extraction would be flawless, and that I would be back on the golf course by spring. Monica hovered just behind him, lightly touching her chest. The sheer audacity of their performance was physically nauseating. They were comforting a man they had methodically poisoned, cheerfully sending me off to be butchered for $5 million and a massive life insurance payout, all while maintaining absolute unyielding eye contact. I played my part flawlessly. I reached out a shaking hand to Preston, thanking him for being such a devoted, reliable son. I thanked Monica for her daily care, stating, "I never could have survived this past month without her nurturing presence." They soaked up my final words with profound satisfaction, fully believing they had secured their bloody victory without raising a single suspicion. The heavy wooden door clicked open, and an orderly dressed in dark green scrubs entered the suite. He announced that the surgical team was ready to proceed. Evelyn let out one final theatrical wail, leaning down to press a dramatic kiss against my cheek. Preston squeezed my shoulder, telling me he would be waiting right here the moment I woke up. I knew the truth. They fully intended to plan my funeral before the afternoon was over. The orderly unlocked the wheels of my bed and slowly guided me out of the suite down a long hallway, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. The temperature dropped significantly as we approached the restricted surgical wing. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles passing overhead, mentally reviewing the final phase of the plan. I was not helpless. Taped securely beneath the fabric of my medical gown, sitting flat against the curve of my hip, was a small encrypted panic button linked directly to Detective Gallagher. He was currently sitting in a heavily armored command vehicle, parked less than 2 blocks away, backed by a fully mobilized, heavily armed task force from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They had monitored the secure communications, verified the international cryptocurrency escrow, and fully documented the cartel threats. They were waiting for the definitive proof of the illegal medical conspiracy to unfold inside the operating theater. The heavy double doors swung open, revealing the cavernous, gleaming expanse of the primary surgical suite. The room was freezing, packed with highly sophisticated, incredibly expensive medical technology. The bright, blinding glare of the massive surgical lamps shone directly down onto the central operating table. I was expertly transferred from the transport bed to the table by a team of silent, masked technicians. I looked around the room, feigning rising panic, my eyes darting frantically from face to face. Dr. Gregory Shaw stood near the instrument trays, adjusting his sterile gloves. He looked at me with cold, detached reptilian eyes, completely devoid of any medical empathy. He offered a practiced, reassuring greeting, explaining that they would administer the anesthesia shortly. But then Dr. Shaw unexpectedly stepped back from the table, deferring his absolute authority. A second surgeon stepped forward from the shadows near the viewing gallery. He was taller, broader, with sharp, intense eyes visible above his blue surgical mask. Dr. Shaw introduced him as Dr. Harrison Blake, claiming he was a renowned visiting specialist brought in to ensure the complex tumor extraction was a complete success. But thanks to Gallagher's extensive, aggressive intelligence gathering, I already knew exactly who this man was. Dr. Harrison Blake was not a visiting oncologist. He was an elite, deeply corrupt transplant specialist flown in directly from Silicon Valley. He was privately hired by the desperate tech billionaire to personally oversee the extraction, ensuring my rare O-negative liver was harvested perfectly and preserved flawlessly for the immediate cross-country flight. He stepped right up to the edge of the surgical table, looking down at my torso, not as a human patient, but as a priceless, highly valuable commodity ready to be aggressively mined. A nurse approached my left arm with a syringe containing the initial sedative. Dr. Blake raised his scalpel, signaling the beginning of the end. The room grew absolutely silent, filled only with the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. The time for deception was permanently over. I slid my right hand slowly down the side of my hip, sliding my thumb over the smooth, raised surface of the hidden panic button. I took one final, deep, steady breath, staring directly into the cold eyes of my executioner, and I firmly pressed the heavy red switch. My thumb pressed firmly against the heavy red switch hidden beneath the sterile fabric of my surgical gown. A small, silent vibration pulsed against my hip, instantly confirming that the encrypted distress signal had been successfully transmitted to Detective Gallagher and the federal task force waiting outside. The trap was sprung, but before the cavalry could breach the reinforced doors of the clinic, I had to survive the next few critical minutes on the operating table. The nurse standing near my left shoulder adjusted the intravenous drip, her eyes completely devoid of any human compassion. I felt the sudden icy bite of the liquid sedative flowing rapidly into my veins. The potent chemical cocktail raced up my arm, carrying a heavy, suffocating wave of artificial exhaustion, designed to drag me down into a permanent, dark sleep. My vision instantly blurred at the edges, the glaring surgical lamps overhead fracturing into brilliant halos of blinding white light. I fought the heavy, pulling tide of the anesthesia with every single ounce of willpower I possessed. I needed to remain conscious just a little bit longer. Dr. Shaw took a half-step backward, gesturing fluidly toward the center of the room. He spoke in a low, respectful murmur, officially relinquishing the surgical field to his highly paid guest. Dr. Harrison Blake moved forward, his movements precise, confident, and heavily practiced. He was a man accustomed to wielding absolute power over life and death. He stood directly beside my right side, the sharp, metallic glint of a surgical scalpel catching the overhead lights. The ambient temperature in the cavernous operating theater felt as though it had plummeted to freezing. Dr. Blake did not look at my face. To him, I was merely an anonymous, willing terminal donor, a tragic but convenient vessel, harboring the $5 million prize his Silicon Valley employer desperately required. I heard Shaw utter a brief, hollow reassurance stating that the patient was heavily sedated and ready for the primary abdominal incision. The rhythmic electronic beeping of my heart monitor seemed to echo endlessly against the sterile tile walls, the only tangible proof that I was still fighting the encroaching darkness. Blake reached down with a gloved hand to adjust the surgical draping. He gripped the edge of the blue fabric covering my lower torso and pulled it back in one smooth, sweeping motion to expose the surgical site. The cold, sterilized air hit my bare skin, sending a violent shiver through my weakening muscles. As the heavy fabric fell away, it completely revealed the right side of my abdomen and the upper curve of my hip. I watched through half-closed, heavy eyelids as Dr. Blake lowered the sharp scalpel toward my flesh. His gaze shifted downward instinctively, scanning the surgical plane to calculate his precise point of entry. But his focused, professional eyes suddenly locked onto the thick, jagged expanse of damaged tissue marring the side of my hip. It was a massive, terrible scar. The raised, discolored flesh branched out wildly across my skin like the twisted, violent roots of an ancient tree. It was a permanent, horrific brand, left behind by third-degree burns sustained over 3 decades ago. Dr. Blake froze instantly. His descending hand halted in midair, the razor-sharp tip of the scalpel hovering a mere inch above my skin. The steady, rhythmic confidence radiating from his posture completely vanished, replaced by an abrupt, rigid tension that radiated through the quiet operating room. He stared at the jagged, unmistakable burn scar, his chest rising and falling, with suddenly shallow, ragged breaths. The absolute silence in the room was shattered by the sharp, metallic clatter of the stainless steel scalpel slipping from his trembling fingers and bouncing loudly across the polished tile floor. Dr. Shaw stepped forward with a sharp gasp of annoyance, demanding to know what was wrong. But Blake ignored him entirely. His wide, shocked eyes slowly tracked upward, moving away from the ruined flesh of my hip and locking directly onto my face. The heavy surgical mask obscured his features, but the sheer, unadulterated recognition burning in his eyes was instantly undeniable. 35 years ago, long before I possessed a sprawling freight empire and billions of dollars, I was driving my rig down a rain-slicked highway outside of Boston. I had witnessed a horrific, violent collision. A small sedan had been crushed beneath a jackknifed transport truck, the twisted metal instantly erupting into a towering inferno. Without thinking, I had thrown myself directly into the blazing wreckage. The intense searing heat had melted the fabric of my heavy work pants directly into my skin, resulting in the massive root-like scar I bore today. But I had managed to shatter the passenger window, reaching into the suffocating flames to drag a terrified, trapped medical student out of the burning car, mere seconds before the gas tank violently exploded. That young, desperate medical student was Harrison Blake. I had saved his life enduring months of agonizing burn treatments and skin grafts so that he could live to fulfill his brilliant potential. Standing in the sterile, freezing operating room, Dr. Blake was finally putting the pieces together. I watched the horrifying realization crash over him like a tidal wave. He realized that the elaborate, comforting narrative Dr. Shaw had fed him was a complete, monstrous fabrication. The man lying sedated on his table was not an anonymous, willing terminal cancer patient graciously donating his organs to a wealthy benefactor. The man on the table was his personal savior. The brilliant, renowned surgeon stumbled backward, colliding heavily against the stainless steel instrument tray. His hands shook violently as he stared at me, the monstrous reality of the illegal trafficking ring fully exposing itself before his eyes. He had unknowingly agreed to butcher the very man who had given him a second chance at life. The heavy sedatives were rapidly pulling me down, turning my limbs to useless lead and making the edges of the bright room fade to black. But I refused to surrender to the chemical darkness just yet. Summoning a final massive surge of adrenaline, I fought the crippling paralysis dragging down my body. I reached out with my right hand, my fingers suddenly closing around Dr. Blake's wrist with the bruising, undeniable strength of a veteran freight hauler. He gasped, completely startled by the sudden, powerful grip of a supposedly unconscious man. I pulled his arm downward, forcing him to lean closely over the operating table until his masked face was mere inches from my own. I looked deeply into his panicked, conflicted eyes. My voice was a strained, raspy whisper, but it cut through the hum of the medical machinery with absolute, chilling clarity. "They are murdering me for my liver, Harrison, my old friend." The words struck him like a physical blow. He stared at me in absolute, utterly horrified, silent disbelief. I deliberately tightened my iron grip on his terribly trembling wrist, stubbornly refusing to let him look away. "Do you want to pay off your life debt right now?" I demanded softly. "The federal agents are waiting outside the doors. Help me to play dead." Dr. Harrison Blake stared down at my gripping hand, the profound shock completely paralyzing his rigid posture. The sterile, freezing air of the operating room felt incredibly heavy as the impossible truth fully washed over his masked face. He looked from my defiant, glaring eyes down to the violent, twisted burn scar on my hip, then back up to my face. 35 years of highly lucrative, globally celebrated medical success had suddenly brought him face to face with the exact man who had pulled his broken, bleeding body from a blazing inferno. I could visibly see the intense moral calculation racing behind his sharp blue eyes. He had walked into this subterranean clinic fully prepared to illegally harvest a human organ for a massive, untraceable fortune, completely insulated by the lie that I was a willing terminal donor. Now the chilling reality of his actions stood exposed. I refused to loosen my bruising iron grip on his wrist, my pulse pounding a steady, rhythmic beat against his skin. I demanded his immediate allegiance, my strained whisper cutting cleanly through the ambient hum of the surgical machinery. I asked him if he was finally ready to repay the ultimate life debt he owed me. The heavy silence stretched for one agonizingly long second. Then a profound, undeniable clarity settled deeply into his gaze. Dr. Blake slowly gave me a single, definitive nod. He deliberately twisted his arm not to break my painful grip, but to gently squeeze my fingers in a silent, binding pact of absolute solidarity. He had instantly understood the grim, terrifying assignment. He was a highly trained elite medical professional, and he knew exactly how to manipulate the delicate threshold between life and death. He gently pushed my hand back down onto the sterile surgical table, instantly transforming his demeanor from a shocked, horrified participant into a commanding, authoritative medical director. Dr. Blake abruptly spun around, his voice booming across the cavernous, brightly lit surgical theater with absolute, unquestionable authority. He pointed a demanding finger directly at Dr. Gregory Shaw, loudly declaring a catastrophic, immediate breach in the stringent infection protocols. Blake fiercely claimed that the primary intravenous line had been severely contaminated by a sudden fluctuation in the positive pressure ventilation system. He manufactured a brilliant, terrifyingly plausible medical crisis out of thin air, aggressively berating the clinic staff for their substandard, dangerous preoperative procedures. Shaw stepped forward, his cold, reptilian eyes narrowing in confused, defensive anger as he attempted to challenge the sudden, chaotic diagnosis. But Blake relentlessly bulldozed right over him, utilizing his superior, internationally renowned reputation to completely dominate the tense room. He loudly ordered Shaw and the assisting scrub nurses to immediately exit the primary surgical field and secure a completely fresh, sterile crash cart from the secondary containment wing located at the absolute far end of the sprawling facility. He explicitly demanded they scrub back in from scratch, a tedious process that would guarantee us several crucial minutes of absolute privacy. Shaw hesitated, his corrupt, calculating mind clearly searching for a logical reason to refuse the demanding order. But the sheer, overwhelming panic projected by the visiting specialist finally broke his stubborn resolve. Shaw barked a sharp command to the nurses, and the entire surgical team hastily rushed out through the heavy swinging double doors, completely abandoning the immediate operating area. The moment the heavy doors securely sealed shut, leaving us entirely alone in the brightly lit room, Blake moved with astonishing, breathless speed. He leaned closely over my face, his breath warm against my ear, as he rapidly whispered his exact medical strategy. He explained that he needed to create a highly convincing superficial incision across my right abdomen to definitively prove to the corrupt clinic staff that the surgical extraction had legitimately commenced. He promised the shallow cut would be entirely cosmetic, causing no structural damage to the muscle tissue, but it would generate enough authentic blood to thoroughly stain the surgical draping and perfectly complete the elaborate illusion. I gave him a curt, steady nod, completely surrendering my body to his expert hands. Blake retrieved a fresh, sterile scalpel from the stainless steel instrument tray. With swift, masterful precision, he drew the razor-sharp blade lightly across my skin, creating a thin, horizontal line right above my ribcage. The sharp, burning sting of the fresh wound barely registered against the massive, overwhelming surge of adrenaline pumping through my entire nervous system. He quickly grabbed a thick stack of white, sterile gauze, heavily applying it to the fresh, bleeding incision. He expertly taped the thick, blood-soaked bandages into place, ensuring the site looked like a genuine, catastrophically aborted surgical entry. Then he moved directly to the complex array of digital monitors tracking my vital signs. His hands flew across the glowing touchscreens, rapidly altering the baseline parameters and silencing the primary warning alarms. He manually manipulated the intravenous medication lines, administering a safe but potent counteractive agent that would severely artificially depress my visible heart rate and plummet my blood pressure to terrifying, critically low levels. I closed my eyes, letting my physical body completely relax into the cold metal table as the agonizingly loud synthetic alarms finally began to blare throughout the surgical suite. Dr. Blake burst out through the heavy double doors, storming directly into the plush private waiting room where my treacherous family eagerly awaited their massive payday. Through the secure, encrypted communication link still active in my hidden earpiece, I listened intently to the unfolding theatrical masterpiece. Blake projected a tone of absolute, devastated professional despair. He looked directly at Preston and Evelyn, delivering the crushing, fabricated news with flawless conviction. I am sorry. He suffered a massive cardiac event upon first incision. He has slipped into an irreversible coma and will not survive the night. The organ is no longer viable. The immediate chaotic eruption of screaming and weeping from my wife and son was a sickening, Oscar-worthy performance. They wailed loudly, desperately crying out for the clinic staff to witness their profound, devastating heartbreak. They hysterically collapsed into each other's arms, putting on a brilliant, flawless display of tragic mourning. But their elaborate, deceitful facade did not fool the hidden microscopic surveillance cameras Detective Gallagher had discreetly planted inside the clinic's private elevators earlier that morning. As the mourning couple was respectfully escorted away from the surgical wing and guided into the secluded stainless steel elevator car, the heavy doors slid shut, sealing them inside. The live encrypted video feed instantly transmitted to Gallagher's command vehicle revealed the absolute horrifying truth. The moment the metal doors locked, the hysterical weeping instantly and completely stopped. Preston and Evelyn stood up perfectly straight, their tear-stained faces abruptly shifting into cold, calculating smirks. Preston raised his right hand, and Evelyn met it in a sharp, victorious high five. She leaned closely toward her son, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper that echoed clearly through the surveillance feed. "Half the plan worked," Evelyn whispered. "At least the insurance is ours." The very last shred of my heart permanently turned to absolute freezing ice, fueling my vow to totally burn their world to ash. 3 days passed since my fabricated demise inside that freezing operating room. For 72 grueling hours, I remained completely concealed inside Detective Gallagher's secure, windowless safe house on the desolate industrial outskirts of the city. Together, we meticulously monitored every single digital footprint my treacherous family left behind. The official coroner's report, brilliantly forged by Dr. Blake and his extensive clandestine network, was formally filed with the state registry. The death certificate explicitly cited a sudden catastrophic cardiac arrest during an emergency abdominal tumor resection. By the early hours of the very next morning, Evelyn had already submitted the heavily expedited claim for my comprehensive $10 million life insurance policy. Preston, meanwhile, had officially accepted the $5 million decentralized cryptocurrency transfer from the desperate Silicon Valley billionaire, confidently assuring his violent cartel loan sharks that their blood money was completely clean and ready to be dispersed. They truly believed my cold, lifeless body was lying abandoned in a sterile refrigerated morgue drawer, patiently awaiting a cheap, unceremonious cremation. They believed they had flawlessly executed the perfect murder. On the evening of the third day, the heavy, relentless Boston rain finally cleared, leaving the dark suburban streets slick and beautifully reflecting the ambient yellow streetlights. Inside my sprawling, silent estate, the supposedly grieving widow and her devoted children decided to host a private, lavish dinner to honor my tragic memory. Thanks to Gallagher's brilliant tactical foresight, we had seamlessly bypassed the mansion's highly sophisticated smart home security system, directly tapping into the encrypted network without triggering a single perimeter alarm or alert. We had quietly activated the hidden microphones and internal surveillance cameras I had installed in the formal dining room years ago to monitor the household staff. I sat perfectly still in the dim, cold blue light of the secure underground safe house, staring intensely at the massive glowing bank of high-definition flat-screen monitors. I wore heavy, professional-grade noise-canceling headphones that delivered their treacherous, unfiltered voices directly into my violently ringing ears, amplifying every single cruel word. The live, high-definition video feed clearly illuminated the grand, formal dining room. The long, polished mahogany table, the very same table where I had proudly hosted countless joyful family holidays, was extravagantly set with my finest imported crystal and vintage heavy silver cutlery. Preston, Evelyn, and Monica sat casually clustered around the head of the long table. They were absolutely not dressed in somber, respectful mourning attire. Evelyn wore a vibrant ruby-red silk dress that draped elegantly across her shoulders, a stunning, expensive diamond necklace sparkling brilliantly against her pale throat. Preston had completely discarded his formal suit jacket. His crisp white sleeves rolled casually up his forearms, revealing a relaxed, supremely victorious posture. In the absolute center of the table sat a massive gleaming silver platter, loaded with imported butter, poached lobster tails, and thick cuts of prime Wagyu beef, surrounded by a mountain of rich, decadent gourmet sides catered from the most exclusive restaurant in the city. Preston leaned forward, reaching across the white linen tablecloth to grab a heavy, intricately carved crystal decanter. My breath caught sharply in my throat. It was my absolute most prized material possession, an incredibly rare 50-year-old single malt scotch that I had carefully preserved for a truly monumental once-in-a-lifetime family milestone. He carelessly sloshed the precious amber liquid into 3 heavy crystal tumblers, indiscriminately filling them to the brim, before handing them out to his mother and his smiling wife. Preston proudly raised his heavy glass high into the warm ambient light of the crystal chandelier, a wide, deeply predatory grin stretching broadly across his handsome face. He loudly proposed a triumphant, mocking toast to the clueless, pathetic old man who had blindly paid for their ultimate, luxurious freedom. The 3 of them eagerly leaned forward, firmly clinking their crystal glasses together. The sharp, melodic chime echoed painfully through my headphones, a sound so purely evil it made my stomach violently churn. They drank deeply, closing their eyes, and actively relishing the expensive, smoky taste of my stolen, hard-earned legacy. Evelyn comfortably leaned back in her high-backed velvet dining chair, gently swirling the expensive scotch around the bottom of her glass. She coldly and methodically began to divide my remaining physical assets, as if carving up a freshly hunted carcass. She explicitly claimed the sprawling oceanfront vacation property in the Hamptons, and my entire vintage European art collection, generously allowing Preston to completely absorb the remaining liquid corporate accounts, the massive fleet of luxury vehicles, and the entirety of the sprawling Boston estate. She spoke about my death with the casual, bored detachment of a wealthy woman discussing a minor inconvenience with her personal gardener. She practically glowed with sheer, unadulterated greed, her eyes shining with the vibrant anticipation of her impending $10 million windfall. Monica laughed, a bright, light, incredibly bubbly sound that completely and horrifyingly contrasted with the sheer pitch-black darkness of her actual soul. She casually speared a tender piece of buttered lobster with her vintage silver fork, chewing thoughtfully and deliberately before turning her bright, smiling eyes toward Preston. She openly joked about how incredibly easy it had been to seamlessly slip the toxic arsenic-laced poison into my morning nutrition juice. She giggled, mimicking my weak, raspy voice and my terrible, trembling cough, flawlessly reenacting the pathetic gratitude I had shown her every single morning. She proudly boasted to her husband and her mother-in-law about how I would look her directly in the eyes, weakly squeeze her hand, and thank her from the bottom of my failing heart, completely oblivious to the fact that she was actively, methodically pushing me into an early, agonizing grave. Preston roared with genuine, deep laughter, slamming his palm loudly against the heavy mahogany table. He profusely praised his wife's brilliant sociopathic acting skills, proudly declaring that she completely deserved an exclusive Academy Award for her flawless performance as the devoted, weeping daughter-in-law. Evelyn willingly joined in the sickening chorus of amusement, delicately dabbing a tear of pure mirth from the very corner of her eye with a crisp white linen napkin. They sat comfortably in the very house my calloused hands had built, drinking the incredibly rare liquor my sweat had purchased, cheerfully laughing over the cruel, calculated manner in which they had repeatedly tortured me. The sheer, unfathomable depravity of their twisted celebration washed over me in heavy, suffocating waves, entirely stripping away the very last lingering remnants of my humanity. I sat perfectly silently in the dark room, intensely gripping the sharp edge of the metal table until my knuckles turned completely white, watching the heartless monsters revel in their temporary, blood-soaked victory. The trap was now fully primed. They had openly confessed to their horrific crimes, loudly celebrating their deceitful triumph on crystal-clear, undeniable video. I slowly removed the heavy headphones, letting the deafening, cold silence of the safe house surround me. My grieving period was officially over. Tomorrow I would finally rise from the dead and confidently ensure their lives permanently burned to the ground. The following evening arrived with a crisp and bitter chill that perfectly matched the ice running through my veins. I stood silently shoulder to shoulder with Detective Gallagher on the wide stone porch of my own massive estate. The heavy mahogany front doors loomed before me, acting as the final physical barrier between my treacherous family and their absolute destruction. I was no longer the frail, shuffling patriarch they had poisoned and sent to the slaughterhouse. I wore a new, sharply tailored pitch-black suit that fit my renewed posture perfectly, standing tall and exuding an absolute unyielding power I had suppressed for far too long. Directly behind me, a highly formidable squad of heavily armed Federal Bureau of Investigation agents stood in total silence. They were elite specialists, meticulously trained in dismantling complex financial crimes and international organ trafficking rings. They wore dark tactical gear, their expressions hardened into masks of professional lethal intent. Gallagher caught my eye and offered a single curt nod. The time for hiding in the shadows was permanently over. I reached forward, gripping the ornate brass handles of the heavy mahogany doors, and shoved them violently inward. The massive doors crashed open with a deafening, thunderous boom that shook the very foundation of the grand foyer. I strode purposefully across the polished marble floor, my heavy leather shoes echoing with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. I walked straight into the formal dining room, stepping directly into the warm, ambient light of the crystal chandelier. The scene before me froze into a grotesque, perfectly preserved painting of arrogant celebration. Evelyn was mid-sentence, a cruel smirk playing on her lips, while Preston held his heavy crystal tumbler in the air for another toast. Monica sat beside him, a piece of rich lobster paused halfway to her mouth. The sheer, unfathomable terror that instantly contorted their faces was the most satisfying sight I had ever witnessed in my entire 73 years of life. The expensive crystal Scotch glass slipped directly through Evelyn's trembling fingers, crashing onto the hardwood floor and shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The rare amber liquid pooled around her expensive red silk heels. Preston let out a high, strangled gasp of pure, unfiltered panic. He stumbled violently backward, his chair scraping harshly against the wood, and I watched with cold satisfaction as a dark, shameful stain rapidly spread across the front of his tailored trousers. He had literally wet himself in sheer terror. Monica dropped her silver fork, her jaw unhinging in a silent, paralyzed scream. I did not say a single word. I simply stood at the head of my own dining table, staring down at the monsters who had desperately tried to harvest my organs for their personal salvation. A heartbeat later, the heavy, synchronized boots of the federal task force swarmed into the dining room. The armed agents swiftly fanned out, creating an impenetrable tactical perimeter around the terrified trio. Gallagher stepped up to my right side, his badge prominently displayed upon his chest. Evelyn shrank back into her velvet chair, her face draining of all color until she resembled a genuine corpse. Preston frantically pressed his hands against his face, shaking his head side to side in a pathetic state of absolute denial. They were utterly trapped, surrounded by the overwhelming, undeniable force of the federal government, completely cut off from the massive fortune they believed they had successfully stolen. The lavish feast spread out before them suddenly looked like a pathetic, rotting illusion. I raised my left hand holding a massive, incredibly thick manila file. I slammed it down onto the center of the mahogany dining table with explosive force, scattering the vintage silver cutlery and knocking over a crystal wine glass. The heavy file burst open, spilling undeniable, catastrophic proof across the white linen tablecloth. I pointed a steady, unforgiving finger at the glossy pages. I told them exactly what they were looking at. I presented the detailed, irrefutable toxicology reports, proving the daily ingestion of lethal arsenic, explicitly outlining Monica's malicious poisoning routine. I pointed to the thick stack of printed time-stamped wiretap transcripts, documenting every single murderous conversation they had shared regarding my false medical diagnosis and the international cryptocurrency escrow account. Finally, I tapped a pristine white document resting right on top of the pile. It was Dr. Gregory Shaw's fully signed, heavily witnessed federal confession. The corrupt clinic director had completely folded under Gallagher's relentless interrogation, eagerly trading their freedom for a slightly reduced prison sentence. I watched Evelyn's eyes scan the terrible documents, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths as the inescapable reality of her permanent destruction locked into place. Preston let out a pathetic, whimpering sob, burying his face directly into the white tablecloth. I leaned forward, resting my knuckles firmly against the polished wood of the table. I looked directly into Evelyn's horrified, panicked eyes, leaning in so closely she could feel the chilling coldness of my breath. "You priced my liver at $5 million and my life at 10. I growled, my voice dropping into a lethal, commanding baritone that reverberated through the silent room. "You severely undervalued me. You truly believed I was a foolish, disposable asset, to be carved up and sold to the highest bidder. You thought my lifelong devotion to this family made me weak, blind to your unimaginable greed." I turned my burning gaze toward Preston, who was actively shaking uncontrollably in his soiled trousers. "You sold your own father to a cartel surgeon to cover your pathetic gambling debts. And Monica," I looked at the pale, trembling woman who had brought me poisoned juice every morning with a cheerful smile. "You smiled in my face while secretly counting the days until my internal organs failed. You are not my family. You are deeply vile, soulless parasites, and your feast is officially over." Detective Gallagher silently stepped forward, signaling the tactical team with a sharp wave of his hand. The heavily armed federal agents moved in with swift, uncompromising precision. The harsh, metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the chaotic sounds of their sudden, desperate weeping. An agent aggressively hauled Preston to his feet, roughly securing his arms tightly behind his back while reading him his Miranda rights. Monica completely collapsed onto the hardwood floor, sobbing hysterically, as a female agent firmly hauled her back up by the shoulders. Evelyn fought frantically, screaming and thrashing wildly as two towering agents easily subdued her permanently, securing the heavy steel cuffs around her wrists. She glared at me with absolute venomous hatred, spitting vile curses and demanding I stop this madness. I simply adjusted the crisp cuffs of my tailored black suit and watched them fall. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I felt a profound, absolute sense of purified justice. As the agents dragged the screaming, sobbing traitors out of my grand dining room and into the freezing Boston night, I stood alone amidst the ruined, lavish feast. The terrible ghosts of my past were finally banished forever, and I had permanently reclaimed my stolen life. The sharp, unforgiving click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the ruined dining room like a final, definitive gavel strike. Preston, Monica, and Evelyn were violently jerked upright by the federal agents, their arms twisted securely behind their backs. The intoxicating, arrogant high they had been riding just moments ago entirely evaporated into a pathetic, desperate reality. My son's legs completely gave out beneath him. He dropped heavily to his knees on the hardwood floor, directly surrounded by the shattered crystal of his own making. He began to scream loudly, begging for my forgiveness, violently sobbing and pleading for the family mercy he had so casually denied me. Monica quickly joined his pathetic chorus, her voice breaking as she practically crawled toward my shoes, wildly claiming she was brutally forced into the massive conspiracy that she truly loved me like a devoted father. I simply stepped back, ensuring my polished leather shoes remained completely untouched by their filthy tears. Evelyn fought against the federal agents holding her arms, her red silk dress twisting awkwardly. She fell to her knees right beside her beloved son, her makeup streaming down her face in dark, ruined tracks. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. She desperately invoked our 40 years of marriage. She invoked the sacred vows we took, the sprawling empire we built, and the supposed unbreakable bond of our family. I looked down at the woman I had deeply cherished for 4 long decades. I felt absolutely nothing. My heart was a frozen, impenetrable vault. I leaned down slightly, meeting her terrified gaze with absolute zero emotion. "You threw my memories in the trash, Evelyn," I stated, my voice completely steady and devoid of any warmth. "You will have the rest of your natural life in a dark federal cell to dig them back out." I turned my back on them as the federal agents finally dragged their sobbing, thrashing bodies out the front doors, firmly leaving my house in complete absolute silence. 6 months have rapidly passed since that defining night of ultimate justice. The sprawling, cursed suburban mansion was swiftly sold to the highest bidder, completely purged from my new life. I finalized the complex divorce proceedings with brutal, uncompromising efficiency, ensuring Evelyn was stripped of every single financial asset she desperately coveted. Preston and Monica were permanently disinherited, legally severed from my vast wealth and my bloodline as they awaited their lengthy mandatory federal prison sentences. The violent cartel loan sharks were swiftly intercepted by Detective Gallagher's highly dedicated task force, permanently dismantling the entire underground criminal network. I took half of my massive accumulated fortune and donated it directly to Dr. Harrison Blake. We established a permanent, heavily funded pediatric surgical fund in his name, ensuring his brilliant hands could continue to save countless innocent lives without the corrupting pressure of immense financial debt. It was a fitting, highly honorable use of the massive fortune my treacherous family had selfishly tried to steal from my failing hands. I now reside in a sleek, modern penthouse high above the bustling city streets. I stood on the sprawling glass balcony tonight, resting my worn hands on the cold metal railing. I looked out over the dark, sprawling expanse of the Boston Harbor, watching the distant lights of the heavy ships smoothly cutting through the black water. The crisp, freezing ocean air deeply filled my recovering lungs with every single steady breath. The heavy burden of their toxic lies is completely lifted from my shoulders. I am completely alone now. The family I painstakingly built simply turned out to be a poisonous, deadly mirage. But as I stand here under the vast, sparkling starlit sky looking toward the boundless horizon, I absolutely do not feel lonely or broken anymore. My heart beats with renewed, unstoppable purpose. I feel fiercely, beautifully, and completely untetherably free. Blood is nothing but a mere biological accident. True loyalty is what actually defines a real family. You must never close your eyes to the subtle red flags just because you desperately want to believe in the fragile illusion of unconditional love. The most dangerous predators do not lurk in dark alleyways. They sleep in our comfortable beds, eat at our dinner tables, and call us by endearing names. When the people you sacrificed your entire life for show you that their absolute greed outweighs your human life, believe them the first time. Your dignity and survival are worth more. Have you ever been deeply betrayed by someone you trusted with your life? How did you personally find the strength to fight back? Share your story in the comments below. If Victor's relentless pursuit of justice resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible life stories.